A Father's Promise by Donnalynn Hess. Chapter 26. Return to Warsaw, March 1945. They that dwell under the shadow shall return, under his shadow shall return, Hosea 14:7a. What Rudy saw as he entered Warsaw almost made him wish he were back in the forest. The houses and shops were even more decrepit than what he had remembered, and the city was in chaos. The streets were crowded not only with returning Poles, but also with Russian, Czech, and Dutch refugees. None of those he passed reminded him of the faces he had once known. Although he desperately needed information, he could not get anyone to even look at him. He spotted one elderly Polish man and called out to him, "Sir?" The man looked up only for a moment, then hurried on. "Everybody is so friendly these days," Rudy said irritably. He then saw a young woman dressed in a white uniform with red sleeve bands. Rudy assumed she was a foreigner. Maybe it's only the Poles who've lost their manners. He asked for him. He said to himself, and he determined to see if she could or would speak to him. "Excuse me," he called. She stopped and turned toward him. "I wonder if you could help me," he blurted out before she had a chance to get away. He was relieved to see her smile. She had understood him, and she did not seem to have any intention of running off. "If I can," she said. Her Polish was not very good, but Rudy could make out what she was saying. "I'm an American," she continued. "I'm here with the Red Cross. They're sending us all over Europe to help where we can. I must admit, though, I've never seen any place where things seem to be in such a dreadful state of confusion." "I know what you mean," said Rudy. "How can I help?" she asked. "I'm looking for my father." Her smile faded. "He was one of the Jews deported by the Germans early in the war," he explained. She shook her head. "I was hoping you were only going to ask me where you could get a hot meal." "I can get my own food," said Rudy. "I've been doing that for some time now." Then, fearing he had sounded rather rude, he added, "I suppose you have hundreds of people asking you to help them find their families." "Thousands, I'm afraid," she said. "But I can take you to the Jewish relocation center. They'd be your best source of information." "I really appreciate it," said Rudy. Her smile returned. She accompanied him to the office building, which was only a few blocks away. "There it is," she said, stopping. "The office you want is on the third floor." "Thank you," said Rudy, waving goodbye. "Hey," she called after him, "what's your name?" "Rudy," he said. "Rudy Kaplan." "Well, Rudy," she said, "I hope you find your father." He smiled as she turned and left. "Thanks again," he called after her. The Jewish Relocation Center was housed in an old building that had some of the windows blown out. He climbed the worn steps until he came to the right office. It was almost as crowded as the streets, but despite the crowd, there was an oppressive silence in the room, broken only by the droning sound of several aged Jews huddled in one corner, reciting psalms in Yiddish. Rudy looked about, trying to decide what to do first. He decided that some of the people were sitting on the benches waiting, while others stalked the room like caged animals. Still others were standing in a line, ending with a man seated at a desk. The line looked to Rudy like the best place to begin. Once he had taken his place, he turned to see that several people across the room were using pencils, nails, and even pieces of stone to scratch their names into the stained, cracked wall. "What are they doing that for?" Rudy asked the man in line behind him. "It's an act of desperation," said the man. It's one more way to convince yourself that you're still alive. When you've lost everything, including your family, no one knows or cares who you are. You can't even prove that you exist. Take you, for instance. What is your name?" "Rudy Kaplan." "Prove it." Rudy was shocked. "What do you mean?" "You tell me you are Rudy, but I don't know Rudy. You could be lying through your teeth, and I wouldn't know it. So rather than believe you, I say you are not Rudy. It's as simple as that." And you have nothing to prove otherwise. Yes, I do, said Rudy said defensively. I have a friend named Oscar who's coming to Warsaw any day now. I talked with him only hours ago, and I have a friend who lives in the village. She knows who I am, and he thought of Ingrid, then remembered that she could tell no one who he was. And there are others, he concluded. You, the man said quietly, almost bitterly, are probably the most fortunate man I've met in days, to yet have so many friends. The man then turned from him and spoke no more. Rudy suddenly felt ashamed for having lashed out at the man. He tried to think of something comforting to say, but he could think of nothing. And he was relieved when he finally heard the man at the desk call, "Next!" Rudy stepped up. "I'm trying to find my father," he said. "Have you checked the list?" The man asked without looking up. "What list?" "Never mind," the man said. "What's your name?" "Rudy Captain." "Age?" Let's see. Rudy paused to calculate. 16? No, wait, that's not right. I'm 17, he said. "What's your father's name?" "Jacob Kaplan." "When was your father taken?" The man continued. "At the end of November 1939, Rudy answered. For the first time, the man at the desk looked up at Rudy. "I'll be frank with you," he said. "I don't think he made it, if he was taken that long ago." "I'm not giving up until I'm sure," Rudy said. The man shrugged. "How old was he when they took him?" 36, Rudy answered. "Occupation?" "He's a doctor," Rudy replied. The man looked up again. "That's good," he said. "Maybe, just maybe, he made it. Doctors and musicians had a better chance than most," he said as he put the paper aside. "That'll be all. Well, we'll see what we can do." "Don't you have a description of him or anything?" asked Rudy. "Don't you want a description of him?" "Descriptions don't seem to do us much good here," the man said. "Nobody looks much the same after the Nazis are done with them." Rudy started to go, then turned back again. "There's one more thing," he said. The man looked up at him wearily. "I'd like to find out about the Sertasek family, too," he said. Handing Rudy the typed copy of a list, he said, "Look on there first. If you don't find their name, get back in line. I'll take the information." Rudy stepped out of the line to scan the list. His heart raced as he found the S's. It was there. Sertasek, 101, Newellipke Street, apartment number 1. 2 occupants. Rudy stopped. Only 2 occupants? Who was missing? Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe whoever typed the list meant 3, not 2. Rudy thought as he handed the list back to the man. "Thank you," he said, and headed for the door. "Hey!" Rudy heard someone call after him. He turned and saw the Jewish man whom he had spoken with in line. "Why don't you write your name up on the wall?" the man said. "Maybe somebody else you know will see it and come looking for you." Although his words seemed harmless, his voice carried a sting. "No," Rudy said, remembering what the man had said earlier. "Maybe later." Rudy sensed the man's scornful gaze as he closed the door behind him, and it did little to lighten his spirit. As he walked toward Nowolupki Street, he thought again of the list. What if it were correct? What if only 2 of the Sertaseks had survived? What if Salik had not been as fortunate as he? Such thoughts continued to plague him even after he had arrived at the Sertasek's door, and it took all the courage he had to reach up and knock. Mr. Sertasek opened the door slowly. Rudy barely recognized him. He was thin, very thin, and his head had been closely shaved. Also, his expression seemed dull, almost lifeless, until he recognized Rudy. "Rudy!" he cried. It was meant as a shout, but the voice seemed thin and fragile. For a moment, Rudy could not reply. Come in, Mr. Sertasek urged. I tell you, Mr. Sertasek, Rudy managed to say when he had finally found his tongue. You're the first one in quite some time to recognize me right off. It's a relief to know that I haven't completely changed. But you have, son, you have, said Mr. Sertasek. Then why was it so easy for you to figure out who I was? Asked Rudy, laughing. Because, said Mr. Surtisek, you're wearing your father's face. Have you heard from him? Asked Rudy hopefully. Not yet, said Mr. Surtisek, but we must be patient. The Jews were shipped all over Europe. Yes, that's what I've heard, said Rudy. It may take him months to get back, and until he does, you will stay with. Mr. Surtisek stopped a moment, as if remembering some great sorrow. With us, he eventually managed to say. Rudy placed his hand on Mr. Surtisek's shoulder, and they stood quietly together. The list was correct, thought Rudy. The thought that he might never see Salik again nearly overwhelmed him, and he banished it from his mind, but it was quickly replaced with thoughts of Mrs. Surtisek, which was no more comforting. You want to see Salik, I'm sure, Mr. Surtisek said. He's here, then? Rudy asked, somewhat hesitantly. Yes, he's in bed. He's not been well, said Mr. Surtisek, but he's getting better. He'll be all right, won't he? Rudy asked. I think so, but it will take time, Rudy. We have been through. He stopped for Surtisek, for Salik stood before them. Rudy could not disguise his shock. Salik's head was shaved like his father's. He was not simply thin, however, he was like a skeleton, and he had grown only slightly since he and Rudy had last seen each other. He was dressed in ragged, shabby clothing, cast-offs. Kind of ugly, aren't I? Salik said, trying to smile. You look better to me right now than you ever looked in all the time we've known each other, Rudy said, walking over to give his friend a hug. One thing's sure, said Salik, growing more cheerful. I haven't had much trouble with my hair sticking up in the back like it used to. Come, sit down, Mr. Surtisek said. You boys can talk while I get us something hot to drink. What happened to you, Rudy? Asked Salik. We thought that they'd taken you at the same time they took your father, but then someone said that you'd escaped. And I must say, you sure don't look like you've paid a visit to the Nazi camps. Thanks to my father, I didn't, Rudy said. He knew they were coming back for him. Your father warned him of that. He made arrangements to have me escape into the forest. You mean you've spent over 5 years in the woods, said Salik? In the woods and the surrounding villages. How in the world did you make it? Asked Sirlik. I mean, even I knew more about outdoor life than you did when I last saw you. That's true, confessed Rudy. But I could sure teach you a thing or two now. Really, Salik, when you're better, there's so much I want to show you. And the rest of his words were lost in a rush of emotion. A walk in the woods sounds good to me, said Salik. Maybe in a week or two. A month or two, his father added as he entered with the tea. The boy's a true Surtisek, never likes to admit he is ever sick or wrong. I seem to remember that, said Rudy, and forced a grin. You're doing a lot better, though, said Salik. We're doing a lot better, said Salik. Sometimes, his father teased. Rudy became serious again. When were you taken to the work camps? April last year, said Salik. We were fortunate to spend only a year in such a place, Mr. Surtisek added. But even a few months was too much for Mama, said Salik quietly. I tell you, Rudy, it was awful. They took us to Auschwitz, said Mr. Surtisek, turning the conversation specifically from his wife. Why did they take you? Asked Rudy. There was an uprising in the ghetto. So, Rudy said, the Germans made their Jewish ghetto after all. They did, said Mr. Surtisek. They crammed all of us into just a few streets, said Salik. But I thought that officer, the one in charge, said Rudy, trying to remember his name. Frankie, said Mr. Surtisek. Yes, that's the one, said Rudy. I thought that he might have been able to put a stop to the ghetto order. He did, but only for a short time, said Mr. Surtisek. It was short, all right, said Salik. About a month after they had taken the council members hostage. Frankie did not stay long, continued Mr. Surtisek. Apparently, he was a rather decent man. He was military, but not a murderer. The Gestapo won the power struggle, and he refused to carry out many of their commands, so they sent him back to Germany, Selig said. It was then they set up the ghetto. A rebellion was inevitable, but those who fought were half starved, explains Mr. Surdasek. The Germans overpowered us. When they did, they cleared the ghetto and sent us all off to camps, said Selig. I wonder what happened to Frankie once he got back to Germany, asked Rudy. I have no idea, said Mr. Surdasek, but I'll tell you this. Even if he lost everything, he was better off than those who continued to do Hitler's work. I do not know how such men could ever sleep at night. Men like Mendy. I think sleeping is the least of Mendy's worries now, said Rudy. He was one of the German officers killed in the ghetto uprising. I'm sure he had no way of knowing that. You have no way of knowing that. You would have hated to be in that place as he stood before God. When Rudy's thoughts turned to Mrs. Surdasek, and he fell silent. I have something that belongs to you, said Mr. Surdasek, rising from his chair. He left the room and returned only moments later, carrying Mr. Kaplan's Bible. Rudy took it and held it gently. How did you get it? He asked. I heard that the Nazis had paid your father a visit, Mr. Surdasek explained. I went where he had been staying as soon as I heard it. I'd heard, you know, that I was not myself those days after the interrogation. Yes, I remember, said Rudy. By the time I got there, Mr. Surdasek said, you were both gone. I didn't know what to do. He paused before continuing, it's hard to lose a friend you have known all your life. I had no assurance that I would ever see him again, and I wanted anything from him, you know. I understand, said Rudy. Believe me, I understand. Yes, I think you do, said Mr. Surdasek. Well, I saw his Bible laying upon the table, and I took it. He could think of no words to express what he was feeling. We're Christians now, Rudy, Selig explained. Mama, too. Rudy could not keep back tears, yet as he felt them streaming down his face, he knew that they were tears of sorrow as well as joy. He could rejoice in the fact that his and his father's prayers had been answered. All of them would one day be together in heaven. Still, as Rudy looked at his friend, he was again reminded that in this life there is yet much grief. Selig seemed so frail, so tired, so much like he needed his mother by his side. His pain brought to Rudy's mind not only the loss of Mrs. Surdasek, but the loss of his own mother also. As the aching loneliness of years returned to him, he found comfort in Christ's words from John 16:33. These things I have spoken unto you, that you might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Wiping his eyes, he turned again to Mr. Surdasek. What finally convinced you to believe? He asked. When we were taken away, he hesitated. Then taking a deep breath, he continued. We were taken to the camps and cattle cars. Everyone was terrified, for by that time in the war, we knew that the camps were not what they had once thought. We knew that only the strongest would be allowed to survive. The old people and young children would be killed. On our cattle car, there was a man, a Gentile, who began to talk of Christ. Of course, he knew that most of the prisoners were Jews, and at first his conversations angered me. Then I saw that his talk seemed to comfort Sarah. One scripture verse he quoted especially seemed to move her. I'm not certain I could find it now, he said, but I remember it. It was one your father had quoted to me once. It said, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. Sarah's whole expression changed when she heard that verse, and though she said nothing, I'm certain that at that moment she accepted Christ as her Messiah. On the other hand, was still too proud to show the stranger that I was even listening. He had to stop again. This is very hard for me, he explained. I know, said Rudy. You don't have to. Mr. Surdasek raised his hand to silence Rudy and continued. When we arrived at the camp, we were pushed off the train. They were shoving the men and boys to one side and the women and girls to the other. The old people and any children 12 and under were being taken away. As I said, Salik was 15 when he was arrested, but he has always been small for his age. When the guards saw him, they shoved him into the line with the children, 12 and under. He cried to me, Rudy, but I could do nothing. Then behind me I heard my wife cry out, "Oh, Christ, save my boy." At that moment, another soldier stepped up, grabbed Salik, and threw him back into the line with the other men and boys, saying, "We can still get some work from this one." For the first time, I saw myself for the helpless fool I was. It took Christ to save my boy, the same Christ that I had scorned for years. From that day, Rudy, I have never ceased to call upon him, nor will I as long as I live. Me either, said Salik softly, and I hope someday soon, I can tell this to your father, said Mr. Sertasek. I hope so too, Rudy managed to say. I hope so too.